I've read about 20 Daniel Silva novels, which I guess makes me a bit of a fan. His novels center around an Israeli intelligence officer named Gabriel Allon, and in his second to most recent novel titled The Order, the plot centers around the murder of the Pope. In part, this murder plot is going to happen because a secret document that has just been found is hidden in the vaults of the Vatican. It's titled The Gospel of Pontius Pilate. Now, you may have never heard of it, and that's because it is a fictitious document, but Daniel Silva unfortunately does a kind of a Dan Brown Da Vinci Code deal with this novel, where he says that this document is going to eviscerate Christianity if it is ever exposed, but the church suppressed it and kept it secret until now, and this will be the thing that blows the lid off Christianity. And in the novel, this statement is made. The book of Matthew is, quote, a literary fiction. And it's a common theme these days, isn't it? And so Jesus is someone that we can never know about because these accounts are just fictitious. We cannot trust them. We are in our series, I Was Just Wondering, and this morning we want to look at the Gospels. The question that we're going to ask is, why should I trust the Gospel accounts? If you do any research at all into Christianity or Gospel studies, you will find very quickly that there are a bunch of experts who will particularly angle their conclusions, whether that's someone like a Daniel Silva or a Dan Brown with the Da Vinci Code, or someone like new atheist Richard Dawkins, who is a biologist, not a biblical scholar, and yet in his book, The God Delusion, he says this, quote, the Bible is a chaotically cobbled together anthology of disjointed documents, composed, revised, translated, distorted, and improved by hundreds of anonymous authors, editors, and copyists. There's an awful lot in there to digest that we could interact with, but let's just focus on two of them. His assertion that the Bible is translated and distorted. Now, if you have ever learned a foreign language, you know that translation is a fairly fluid thing. There are certain principles and rules that you follow, but there's some fluidity to it, depending on your approach to translation. So, for example, I learned fourth form French. The most important of all phrases, fermez la bouche, literally, shut the mouth, which is very bad English. You would never translate it that way in English. The most literal translation that would be a good translation would be shut your mouth. But you could also translate it legitimately, shut up. You could also translate it legitimately, keep quiet. It's a little more colloquial, but each one of those is a legitimate translation. They communicate the intent and the meaning of the original. And it's not as if the Bible translations distort that. When Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life, and you compare 10 different translations, not one of them will have Jesus saying, I am hungry, so why don't we go down to the fish and chip shop and get some kai? No, you don't have that kind of distortion that's implied by Dawkins' account. Well, let's look at 3 tests for an ancient document. The Bibliographical Test deals with the number and the quality of the manuscripts and the time between when the original autograph was written and the earliest extant manuscripts that we have are in existence. That's the Bibliographical Test. The second test is the External Evidence Test, which looks at external corroboration outside of the document itself, things like archaeology, inscriptions, and so on, which can verify the veracity of the account. The third test is the Internal Evidence Test, and this looks at the the type of writing, the claims that are made, internal consistency, anything within that might lend to its credibility or detract from it. These three tests were devised by a military historian named C. Sanders, not to be confused with Colonel Sanders, and they're very good tests for ancient documents. So we'll look first at the Bibliographical Test. So this test looks at the quantity of manuscripts that we have available for any ancient piece of literature. And I have a chart here outlining the number of manuscripts that are in existence for the New Testament versus the second closest document from antiquity, which is Homer's Iliad. You'll see that for Homer's Iliad, there are 643 manuscript copies that we have, whereas for the New Testament, we have almost 25,000. These are Greek translations. These are other Syriac and Coptic and so on translations. We can reconstruct the text of the New Testament from all of these many, many thousands of manuscripts. So in terms of manuscript attestation, the New Testament is second to none. Not just in terms of the number of manuscripts, but on this next chart, the time gap between when we know the original was written and the earliest manuscript copy that we have. You'll see that in the yellow highlighted column, the time gap is huge for all of these ancient documents from antiquity, from Homer's Iliad to Herodotus' history, Thucydides' history, Plato's tetralogies, Caesar's Gallic Wars, and so on. You'll notice that the number of manuscripts generally is in the single digits, less than 10, and that that's on the very right-hand side of that chart. And the column just to the left of it, which is highlighted, you'll notice that the vast majority have a gap of over 1,000 years between when we know the original was written and the earliest copy that we have. So the New Testament comes out really, really shining. In this next picture, this is a picture of P66, Papyrus 66, one of the most famous of the papyri, known as the Bodmer Papyri. It was discovered in Egypt in 1956, and it dates from around 200 AD. It contains most of John's Gospel and what follows in the New Testament. So there we have some 120, 130, 40 years after the New Testament was written, this codex, this book, this collection of papyri. The next picture is known as P52, Papyrus 52, otherwise known as the John Rylands Papyri, and this contains just a few verses from John 18, but it is one of the earliest fragments that we have, dating within about 30 years or so of John's Gospel. Putting this all together, we can say confidently that the quality of biblical manuscripts is exceptional. It is better than the 10 best documents of antiquity combined. And so F.F. Bruce says there is, quote, no body of literature in the world which enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament. I love what Peter Williams says about it. He says, it is really appreciated that for us to have 4 Gospels about Jesus is remarkable. That is an abundance of material to have about any individual of that period. In fact, even though Jesus was on the periphery of the Roman Empire, we have as many sources about his life and teaching as we have about the activities and conversations of Tiberius, who reigned between AD 14 and 37, emperor during Jesus' public activities. And that is from Peter Williams' excellent little book, Can We Trust the Gospels? He is a Cambridge scholar, absolutely superb book and wonderful scholarship, very accessible. So take a look at this chart that Williams has. He contrasts the main sources that we have about the Emperor Tiberius with the main sources about Jesus, and there are 4 for each. There's, for Tiberius, Vilius Paterculus, Roman history. The earliest copy that we have is from the 16th century, but it was written in AD 30. Tacitus's Annals, Suetonius, writing about Tiberius, and Cassius Dio's Roman history. And so you'll see that, with the exception of Tacitus, who's got a lot more words, but most of what he writes about is not about Tiberius personally and specifically, but about the times of Tiberius and what's going on in the empire. And so that wealth of words that's listed there, 48,000, is a little bit misleading. Paterculus was a patron of Tiberius, and so he's not a particularly trustworthy source. But you'll notice that the gap varies from some 700 to 1500 years between when the original was written and the earliest manuscript copy that we have. Contrast that with Jesus, and you'll notice that the number of words goes anywhere from about 11,000 words up to 19,500 words for Luke, the longest gospel. And the earliest complete copies that we have for any of those Gospels is from the 4th century. They were written in the second half of the 1st century. The earliest incomplete copies that we have date from late 2nd and 3rd centuries. So you can see this contrast between the most popular ancient figure, Tiberius, who was a contemporary of Jesus, and the accounts about Jesus, which leads Williams to write, quote, Jesus has more extended text about him in generally closer proximity to his life than his contemporary Tiberius, the most famous person in the then known world. Just amazing. Okay. The second test is the external evidence test. And there is so much material that we could look at with this, but I just want to mention one thing. This test looks at external corroboration outside of the document, so it deals with particularly archaeological discoveries that can verify or undermine the veracity of a document. When I was in Israel, I've had the privilege of visiting 3 times. On one of my trips, I took this photo of the Pilate inscription. Now, Josephus and Tacitus mention Pilate, but there were those who were skeptical about Pilate's existence because the Gospels made so much of him. Yet in 1961, which in historical terms is relatively recently, the Pilate inscription was discovered by an Italian archaeologist, and this is a facsimile of it. The original is in Jerusalem, but this photo was taken at Caesarea Maritime on the coast where it was discovered. And it reads, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. In recent years, they've discovered the house of the high priest in Jerusalem, Caiaphas. I was reading just this week that they discovered a internal toilet in an aristocrat's house in Jerusalem. This is internal primitive plumbing, but they're always discovering things. And one writer has said every time that an archaeologist's spade goes into the ground, a skeptic is buried. The third and final test for an ancient document which we wish to explore is the internal evidence test. And this test asks questions about what is happening within the document. Are there things that are inconsistent with the era that it is supposedly from, with what we know that the writer would have known or not have known, with the kind of language that is used, with what is reported. So we begin this with noticing that each of these four accounts are what we call primary source accounts. In other words, they are, or they contain, or they reflect primary source eyewitness accounts from the second half of the first century. They were all written in the first century. Even the most skeptical New Testament scholars date them within that period. A lot of scholars will date them prior to AD 70, when Jerusalem fell and was destroyed by the Roman general Titus. And the Gospels don't refer to that event, so a lot of scholars think that the synoptics, at least, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were written pre-AD 70. Almost all scholars agree that John was written late. Anyway, the writers of the Gospels were people who either were eyewitnesses themselves, as in the case of Matthew and John, both of whom were disciples. Matthew was the tax collector that Jesus said, "Hey, come and follow me." John was the disciple whom Jesus loved, had a very close relationship with Jesus, and spent a lot of time with him, got to observe him up close. Mark was not a disciple, and neither was Luke. Mark, says Papias, one of the early church fathers, was the interpreter of Peter. Peter, of course, was one of the primary disciples, very close to Jesus, and had a ringside seat, and evidently shared his stories and observations with Mark, who wrote them down. Mark is very likely, say a lot of scholars, the earliest gospel. The relationship between the three synoptics is a complicated one, but Mark may have written as early as the early 50s, so within conceivably 20 years after Jesus died. He was likely the young man who ran from the garden. They grabbed his coat, and it said his outer cloak, and he ran naked. His mother, we read in the book of Acts, had a house in Jerusalem where the house church met. She was evidently a woman of means. Luke was a doctor. He was an associate of Paul and a historian, and he writes in the prologue to his gospel to someone named Theophilus. He says, "Look, I've carefully investigated everything so that you may know the certainty of what you have been told." Luke, Acts, is a kind of a two-part history of Jesus' life and then the early church, and that prompted William Ramsay to say that Luke is a consummate historian. He's a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians, said the archaeologist Ramsay. So these are primary source accounts. But what about bias and memory? Undoubtedly, the writers had a theological agenda, and you hear this all the time. Well, they were biased, they can't tell the truth. Well, the reason that they had this bias towards Jesus is that he won them over. He convinced them. They were skeptics, they were doubters at times. Jesus himself said they were people of very little faith. They abandoned Jesus. So the reason that they end up with this bias is because Jesus won them over. And we're going to discover that they are disciplined, honest witnesses. They present their own faults very honestly and have a clear view of what's true and false, and claim to be speaking truth as they testify. Witnesses in any court of law will have a bias, and yet that doesn't mean that they cannot speak truth about what they've witnessed. There's a documentary series on right now called I Am, and that young man who came through Gloria Vale and is angry about Gloria Vale and what he experienced. Do we say, well, nothing of what he says is true because he's angry? Well, the reason he's angry is that he witnessed those things. He experienced those things. That's the cause of his bias. His bias doesn't nullify the truth of what he is saying. Well, what about memory? I've been reading this fantastic book, this massive tome by an absolutely first-rate New Testament scholar, published so much stuff. Good. This is a brand new book. It's called Christobiography, Memory, History, and the Reliability of the Gospels. And he has some chapters in there on memory studies. Peter Williams also addresses memory studies. Bart Ehrman, who is one of the big skeptics about Christianity, talks about what's known in the States as the telephone game, or it used to be known here as Chinese whispers. Probably not very PC to call it that these days. But the idea is you whisper something once in someone's ear, and it can only be once, and it gets distorted within, 30 seconds as it goes through a line of transmission of 5 people. Well, both Keener and Williams point out that that is not a particularly good analogy for how the Gospels are transmitted. Williams says that teaching karate is probably a better analogy, where you have this one-on-one instruction and it's very clearly communicated, it's clearly understood, it is repeated and retained over time. The rabbis after New Testament times had a statement that a good student is like a, quote, plastered cistern which loses not a drop. The rabbi would, as it were, pour his teaching into the disciple, and the disciple would not lose a drop of that teaching. I remember having friends in high school, Jewish friends, who would go through their bar mitzvah at age 13 and recite large chunks of the Torah. In our day of Google and calculators and instant information, we forget that people can rely in past times on memory in a way that we just don't today. Even the Guinness Book of Records back in 1974 recorded that a resident of, it would have been then Burma, Myanmar today, recited 16,000 pages of Buddhist canonical texts. 16,000 pages. When you think of the distance, the time distance between the disciples and the events of the gospel, which were so transformative to them, because memory is cemented by powerful transformative events, by repetition, by certain mnemonic devices where you can remember things, and Jesus taught that way with parallelism and repetition. But you think of the time distance and think of our own era, for those of us who've been around for a number of decades. Just think back to David Longey's time. He was Prime Minister from 1984 to 1989. So we're talking about, 35, 40 years in that kind of vicinity. And, you remember that debate that he had at the Oxford Union in 1985?
With which we would like an answer, sir.
And I'm going to give it to you if you hold your breath just for a moment. I can smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
And it's very easy to reconstruct from people who knew a person, whether it's a David Longey or an Abraham Lincoln or a George Washington or a Winston Churchill, from people who knew, and you get these stories and these anecdotes and these quotes. Think of some of the wonderful quotes from Winston Churchill. Well, Jesus was a teacher. He was a radical teacher. He was a famous teacher. and his sayings were remembered. I want to read you something from another wonderful book. This is by Professor E.M. Blaikie, who was Professor of Classics at Auckland University. He's dead now, but this wonderful little book, Jesus Christ, Man or Myth, he's written probably 25 scholarly books. And this is just a fascinating illustration that he gives. He says, a curious illustration of this came during the Cook bicentennial celebrations in New Zealand. If the congruent journals of Captain Cook and Joseph Banks for November 8th, 1769 are read, a full account of an incident in Whitianga in Mercury Bay will be found. Lieutenant Gore, to Cook's displeasure, shot a Maori who had stolen a piece of cloth and was making off shoreward from the Endeavour in a canoe. It was an unpleasant incident, relieved only by the Maori's recognition of the thief's folly and fault. More than 80 years later, 80 be it noted, not the 60 which lie between the biblical events and John's description of them, an aged Maori, Te Horeta Te Taniwha, lived at Coromandel and reminisced to Lieutenant Governor Wynyard about the incident. The officer had the story taken down, and the account, some 1,500 words, was first printed in White's Ancient History of the Maori. The old gentleman told how, as a small boy, he had gone aboard the Endeavour. He described, quote, the chief goblin, Captain James Cook, and spoke of his bearing and authority. He spoke in detail of the theft of cloth and told how Gore went below, produced, quote, a walking stick, unquote, and pointed it at the canoe which was paddling away. Quote, thunder pealed and lightning flashed, end quote. And when the canoe reached the shore, eight rose to leave the canoe, but the thief sat still with the dogskin mat and the garment of the goblin under his feet. His companions called to him, but he did not answer. One of them went and shook him, and the thief fell back into the canoe. Blood was on his clothing, and a hole was in his back, end quote. And Blaikie says, note the touch of simple authenticity as the old man put the impressions of childhood into childhood's speech 80 years after the events. And for all of the difference between the language of the old man and the austere and competent prose of Cook and his botanists, the narratives coincide. Ancient memory is a wonderful thing. Now, that example was of 80 years later, a recollection from 80 years later that was really quite detailed. But the crucial period in the gospel transmission and reconstruction is not 30 to 60 years, but the first 3 to 6 years, this is what memory experts tell us, as those accounts are retold and reflected upon and discussed. For example, often the disciples, even in the Gospels, would discuss Jesus' teaching. What does he mean by that? What does he mean by this? What's he saying? On the road to Emmaus, you have these two disciples who encounter the risen Jesus and ironically are discussing the significance of these events. So they replayed them. They taught in a whole variety of situations, and this cemented these memories very, very early on. It wasn't that 40, 50 years later, or even 30 years later, they decided, oh, maybe we should tell that story. What was that one again? No. So that's bias and memory. Another internal evidence of the Gospel's veracity and truthfulness is the fact that you have harmful elements present. Things that you would not include in a document if you're making it up, if you're wanting to foist this hoax on the world. Things like talking about the competition between you and the other disciples, the disciples' stupidity and lack of faith. It doesn't make you look good. You wouldn't make that kind of stuff up unless it was true. Jesus' hard sayings, which even today people struggle with. Eat my flesh, drink my blood. Jesus says offensive things, difficult things. They would not report that if they're trying to smooth things out and do a salesman job on the world. Jesus' ignominious death on the cross, the death that someone who was cursed experienced, not a good look if you're trying to foist a religion on the world. Women as the first eyewitnesses, because in that particular day and age, women didn't have standing in court. Their testimony was not something that you would employ to bolster your case. So the fact that women are presented as the first eyewitnesses is evidence that their reporting is truthful, it is restrained, it is accurate. Then there are also helpful elements that are absent. Things that if the early church created these documents later on, it would be advantageous for them to put words into Jesus' mouth and have him clarify some very important and even divisive issues. Things like clarity on the circumcision debate, which was ripping the church apart in Acts chapter 15. The role of the Gentiles. What about church government structure? Who's meant to be at the top and what are they meant to be called? How do you live as a scattered and exiled church? These are things that we would expect to have been written into Jesus' statements if in fact they were created later on, as some claim, by the early church. Then there are geographical references which show that these guys really knew their stuff. They were eyewitnesses. They were there. They mention 26 towns and villages, not just the big main ones that are somewhat known widely like Jerusalem, but podunk towns like Bethphage or Cana or Sychar. Very specific expressions regarding bodies of water that for a fisherman were like the ocean, the Sea of Galilee. And that's the kind of thing that Matthew, who was from that region, and John and Peter, who gave his account to Mark, each of them refers to the Sea of Galilee. Well, it's just something a little bit bigger than Lake Taupo. It's not a sea. Interestingly, Luke doesn't call it that. He just calls it the lake. He wasn't from that particular region. They also refer to it in its local name, Kinnereth, or the Roman name, the Sea of Tiberius. There are special places in and around Jerusalem and elsewhere. The Field of Blood, Golgotha, which means skull, the place of the skull, Solomon's colonnade. Even something as seemingly insignificant as elevation. You know, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus tells the story about a man who went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And I was astonished when I first took that trip, because you just go down, 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 down. You drop down about a mile in a very short time. And Jericho is the lowest city in the world. It is 800 feet below sea level. And so in this almost an aside manner, as Jesus is telling this parable, there are just these marks of authenticity internally. It's amazing. Well, the last area that we want to look at internally in these documents is the area of names. And names are fascinating things because they can date a document, so to speak. Think of names that are popular right now, or which have come and gone in various eras. Of course, at one point in Germany, Adolf was a very popular name. You generally don't find that name being used that often these days. My wife Doreen says that her name dates her. And so there are names Brittany or River. You can link these names to different areas, and the same was true in Palestine. About 20 years ago, there was a comprehensive study that was done on Palestinian names. And they looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls, they looked at early rabbinic texts, ossuaries, which are bones collected in these little urns, which are named. And they did this massive study of all of the Palestinian names that were common and looked at them from between 330 BC to AD 200. So it's about a 500-year spread, with the majority between 50 BC and AD 135. They excluded fictional characters in mention, and I've got a chart here for you to show you the most popular names in Palestine. So Simon was very popular. That was number one. There were 243 occurrences in all of these different sources, and it appears 8 times, 8 individuals in the New Testament. Joseph was second most popular. It appears 6 times in the New Testament. Eleazar or Lazarus is a bit of an outlier. There's only one of those, even though that's the 3rd most popular name. But then notice Judah, Johanan, John, and Joshua, the percentages that, or the numbers, proportions that you would expect, reducing based on general popularity and occurrences. And what's interesting about this is that this list of names is very different from those that would appear, say, in Egypt, in the 5 Jewish quarters. The popular names among Jews in Egypt, just down the road from Palestine, were Eleazar, Sabbatius, Joseph, Dositheus, Pappus, Ptolemaeus, and Samuel. Completely different list. And so if someone from another location like Italy or Greece or Egypt is writing these Gospels, trying to project into a Palestinian context, you just can't do it that way. It just does not work. These are authentic names that are used authentically. The next chart, you see a pretty close correspondence. Men with the 2 most popular names, Simon or Joseph, in Palestine, 15.6%, and in the Gospels, 18.2%. That's really quite close. Men with one of the 9 most popular names across that region generally, from all of those different sources of evidence, 41.5%, and in the Gospels or Acts, 40.3%. You know, there's another aspect to this that is very interesting, and that is the disambiguation of the names where there could be confusion. So since Simon is the most popular name, we find this clarifying, this disambiguation in the Gospels. So Simon the fisherman becomes Simon Peter. Other Simons are distinguished. So there's Simon the leper, Simon the Pharisee. Someone writing outside of Palestine is not going to make those distinctions. Is not going to understand that you need to do that in that context because there's so many different Simons that it was the most common name. So what does all of this prove? Does it prove beyond any doubt that Jesus rose from the dead? That he is who he said he was? No, it doesn't prove that. We can't have absolute certainty. But what we can have is evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. We can have inference to the best explanation. You see, we've looked at 3 evidences for the reliability of an ancient document. We've scrutinized the gospel texts with the bibliographical test, the time and number of manuscript test. We've looked externally at corroboration outside of the Gospels. And then we've looked internally for marks of consistency or inconsistency. We've looked at their claim to be telling the truth. We've addressed matters of bias and memory. We've looked at some of the intricate details down to the level of the commonality of names and their frequency of use in the Gospels. These don't prove that the Gospels are true, but I think they make a pretty compelling case for people who are open to consider the evidence honestly. One of those people was C.S. Lewis. He was professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Oxford University and became a Christian as an adult after evaluating the evidence. And after years and years of study, he said this, published in his little book, Fern Seeds and Elephants. He said, if someone tells me that something in a gospel is a legend or a romance, I want to know how many legends and romances he has read, how well his palate is trained in detecting them by the flavor. I've been reading myths, legends, romances, vision literature all my life, he says. I know what they are like. I know that they are not like this. They're not like the Gospels, he says. Lewis came up with what is now called the trilemma, that Jesus made astonishing claims. He claimed to be God in the flesh who was giving his life a ransom, a payment for many, that he was laying down his life for the sins of the world, and that any who would place their faith in him would have their sin forgiven and have eternal life. That is an astonishing claim, said Lewis. Either he was the God of heaven or the devil of hell. He was either on the level of someone who claims that he is a poached egg because that claim is so astonishingly ludicrous, or if his life verified what he was claiming, perhaps it is true. And so with this famous trilemma, he said Jesus is either a liar, a lunatic, or he is Lord. Another category that people often add today, and we've addressed some of those objections, is that he is a legend, that the documents are unreliable, you can't trust them, they're unhistorical, they were written sometime late in the 2nd century, etc. That's simply not true. And so the question for you and me is, what are we going to do with the Gospels? More importantly, what are we going to do with the Jesus of the Gospels? I hope that you wrestle deeply with those questions because they really do have eternal significance. Perhaps the next step for you is to read those primary source accounts, maybe starting with the Gospel of John. And then can I refer you to Peter Williams' book if you want to dig a little deeper. It's short, but Cambridge scholar, very well written, very well researched, and he can point you to other things too. Can We Trust the Gospels by Peter Williams? I'm excited for this journey that you're on and your next steps. God bless.